On a gray August morning in 1940, a Polish fighter ace with 7 confirmed kills to his name was ordered to ride a tricycle, not a motorcycle, not a training aircraft, a child's tricycle with 3 rubber wheels and a tiny metal seat. The British flight instructor stood there with a clipboard watching the 28-year-old combat veteran pedal in circles around a concrete square at RAF Northolt. The instructions were clear. Demonstrate coordination. Prove you can balance. Show us you're fit to fly. The Pole's name was Flying Officer Zdzisław Henneberg. 6 weeks earlier, he had been dogfighting Messerschmitts over France, pulling 6 Gs in a screaming dive while cannon shells punched holes in his wings. He had escaped from Poland after the Nazi invasion. He had escaped from France after the Nazi invasion. And he had crossed the English Channel in a stolen fishing boat with engine oil on his hands and hatred in his chest. And now a British sergeant was asking him if he understood how to use the brake pedal. Around him, 24 other Polish pilots went through the same ritual. They did calisthenics. They took written exams on British radio codes. They practiced cockpit procedures in wooden mockups while the real hurricanes sat on the tarmac, engines cold, gathering dust. The RAF called it orientation training. The Poles called it something else entirely. Words that didn't translate politely into English. The British officers watched these foreign pilots with skeptical eyes, and the official assessment reports used words like undisciplined, reckless, and temperamentally unsuitable for modern fighter tactics. One senior commander wrote that the Poles were too aggressive and lacked the cool analytical judgment required for RAF combat doctrine. They were considered liabilities. They were considered risks. They were considered at best a political gesture to the Polish government in exile. Nobody imagined they were looking at the deadliest fighter squadron of the entire war. The problem facing the Royal Air Force in the summer of 1940 was simple arithmetic with a terrifying answer. The Luftwaffe was sending 1,000 bombers a day across the Channel. The RAF was losing pilots faster than it could train them. Young British aviators with barely 20 hours in a Spitfire were being thrown against German aces who had been perfecting their craft since Spain. The average life expectancy of a new RAF pilot was measured in weeks, sometimes days. The tactical doctrine wasn't helping. The official RAF manual demanded precise formation flying. Squadrons were supposed to arrange themselves into elegant patterns called VICs, 3 aircraft in a perfect V-shape, then stack those VICs into larger formations. The idea was borrowed from peacetime air shows. It looked beautiful on parade day. It was a death sentence over the Channel. The problem was reaction time. When a flight of Messerschmitt Bf-109s came screaming out of the sun at 400 miles per hour, the RAF pilots were supposed to maintain formation, follow their leader, and wait for coordinated orders. But German pilots didn't wait for orders. They hit fast, hit hard, and vanished into the clouds before the British could even break their pretty patterns. The RAF was fighting a street brawl with ballroom dancing rules. Even worse was the firing doctrine. British pilots were trained to open fire at 400 yards, the maximum effective range of their 8 Browning machine guns. The theory was sound. Start shooting early, fill the sky with bullets, and hope something connects. The reality was different. At 400 yards, a Bf-109 was a smudge against the gray English clouds. A burst of gunfire at that range was like throwing pebbles at a passing taxi. The bullets scattered across hundreds of feet of empty sky. The German pilots simply rolled away and came back for the kill. The RAF knew the tactics weren't working. The kill ratios proved it. But doctrine is doctrine. The manual was written by men with more medals than combat hours, and questioning the manual was not encouraged. Into this failing system walked a group of men who had no respect for manuals, no faith in doctrine, and absolutely nothing left to lose. The Polish pilots who arrived in England were not trainees. They were survivors. They had fought the Luftwaffe in September 1939, when the German blitzkrieg crushed Poland in 5 weeks. They had watched their cities burn from their cockpits. They had seen their airfields bombed into craters and their squadrons destroyed on the ground. When Poland fell, they didn't surrender. They escaped across the Romanian border, made their way to France, and joined the fight there. When France fell 6 months later, they escaped again, and they crossed the channel on anything that could float. Fishing boats, coal barges. A British destroyer picked up one group from a beach in Brittany while Stukas screamed overhead. By the time they reached England, these men had been fighting for a year straight. They had logged more combat hours than most RAF pilots would see in their entire careers. They knew the Messerschmitt Bf 109 the way a boxer knows his rival. They knew its blind spots, its turning radius, its tricks. They knew that German pilots pulled right when they panicked, because the torque of the engine made left turns harder. They knew that a 109's fuel injection system gave it an advantage in a dive but made it sluggish in a sustained climb. Most importantly, they knew that 400 yards was a joke. You couldn't kill a man at 400 yards. You could scare him, maybe. Or you could scratch his paint. But if you wanted to rip the engine out of a Messerschmitt, if you wanted to see the pilot's face through the canopy before you pressed the trigger, you had to get close. Suicidally close. Close enough to see the rivets on the fuselage, close enough to taste the exhaust. The Polish doctrine was simple. They called it opening the can. You didn't shoot at the bomber. You flew into the bomber. You closed the distance to 100 yards, sometimes 50, until the target filled your entire windscreen like a gray metal wall. Then you fired. At that range, you couldn't miss. Your bullets didn't scatter across empty sky. They concentrated into a single point of destruction. One 2-second burst at 50 yards did more damage than 20 bursts at 400. The British thought this was insanity. They called it reckless, undisciplined, suicidal. They didn't understand that these men had already lost everything. Their country was gone. Their families were under Nazi occupation. They had watched their friends die in burning cockpits over Warsaw and Paris. They weren't afraid to die. They were afraid to die without taking Germans with them. The transformation from outcasts to legends began on August 30th, 1940, during what was supposed to be a routine training flight. 303 Squadron had been officially declared non-operational. They weren't trusted with real missions yet. They were still doing their orientation exercises, their tricycle coordination tests, their radio code exams. That afternoon, a flight of Hurricanes led by Flight Lieutenant Athol Forbes took off for what the British called a familiarization patrol. No ammunition was supposed to be loaded. No combat was expected. It was essentially a sightseeing tour of the English countryside. But someone had loaded the guns anyway. And when a formation of German bombers appeared on the horizon heading for an aircraft factory, the Polish pilots didn't wait for permission. They didn't radio for orders. They broke formation and attacked. Flying Officer Ludwik Paszkiewicz was the first to score. He dove on a Dornier Do-17 bomber, closing to less than 100 yards before opening fire. The burst lasted 2 seconds. The bomber's engine exploded. It spiraled into a field and burned. Paszkiewicz had just become 303 Squadron's first kill. By the time the flight landed, the pilots were grinning like wolves. The British commanding officer was furious. They had violated orders. They had broken formation. They had engaged without authorization. The Poles didn't care. They had proven what they came to prove. They were not students, they were hunters. The next day, 303 Squadron was declared operational. The RAF had no choice. The Battle of Britain was at its peak and fighter command was hemorrhaging pilots. They couldn't afford to keep experienced killers on the bench. The tricycle tests were over. The Poles were cleared for combat. What followed was a month of controlled mayhem that rewrote the record books. The German bomber crews had never seen anything like it. They were accustomed to British fighters that stayed at a respectful distance, that fired careful bursts from 400 yards, and that peeled away after a single pass. The Poles fought like demons. They flew straight into the bomber formations, guns blazing, ignoring the defensive fire from the rear gunners. They got so close that they came home with oil stains from the bombers they had destroyed. The most dangerous pilot in the squadron wasn't even Polish. His name was Josef František, a Czech sergeant who had escaped from Czechoslovakia, then Poland, then France. He flew as a guest with 303 Squadron because he refused to join his own country's unit. The Czech commanders thought he was uncontrollable. They were correct. František refused to fly in formation. He refused to follow orders. He would take off with the squadron, then break away and hunt alone, stalking the edges of bomber formations like a lone shark. His tactic was to wait until the main engagement started, then pick off the stragglers, the damaged bombers trying to limp home. In 6 weeks, he shot down 17 German aircraft, more than any other Allied pilot in the Battle of Britain. He was killed in October when his Hurricane crashed during a landing approach. Some said engine failure, some said exhaustion. He had been flying 3 and 4 sorties a day. The squadron's signature tactic became legendary among both allies and enemies. The Luftwaffe circle, a defensive spiral that RAF doctrine rejected as outdated, became a killing ground when the Poles flew it. They would form a tight ring, each aircraft covering the tail of the one in front, and simply wait for the Germans to make a mistake. When a Bf 109 dove into the circle, the Poles didn't scatter. They tightened, and the German pilot would suddenly find 3 Hurricanes on his tail instead of 1. September 15th, 1940, the day the Luftwaffe threw everything it had at London. Over 1,000 German aircraft crossed the Channel, the largest aerial assault in history up to that point. Fighter Command scrambled every squadron it had. 303 Squadron took off from Northolt at 11:30 in the morning and didn't stop fighting until dark. The engagement over London became a swirling chaos of tracer fire and burning wreckage. Flying Officer Jan Zumbach spotted a formation of Dornier bombers at 20,000 feet, their bomb bay doors already opening over the city. He pushed his throttle to emergency power and dove. The Hurricane screamed toward the bombers at over 400 miles per hour. The airframe shuddered. The controls stiffened, and Zumbach watched the altimeter unwind like a broken clock. 18,000 feet, 16,000 feet. The bombers grew larger in his gun sight, transforming from gray dots into massive twin-engine machines bristling with defensive guns. The German rear gunners opened fire. Tracers whipped past the Hurricane's canopy, close enough to hear. Zumbach didn't weave. He didn't dodge. He flew straight into the stream of fire, betting his life on the few seconds it would take to close the distance. 200 yards, 150 yards, 100 yards. The Dornier filled his windscreen. He could see the black crosses on the wings. He could see the glass nose where the bombardier sat. He pressed the firing button. 8 Browning machine guns erupted simultaneously, sending 160 rounds per second into the bomber's fuselage. At 100 yards, the bullets didn't scatter. They concentrated, and the left engine exploded in a fountain of orange fire. The wing folded. The bomber rolled onto its back and fell. Zumbach pulled up hard, his vision graying at the edges from the G-forces. He had been in the engagement for exactly 12 seconds. 1 bomber destroyed, bombs falling into empty fields instead of London streets. He found another target and dove again. When the smoke cleared on September 15th, the RAF had broken the back of the Luftwaffe. German losses were so severe that Hitler postponed the invasion of Britain indefinitely. 303 Squadron claimed 14 confirmed kills that single day, more than any other unit in Fighter Command. By the end of the Battle of Britain, the squadron's total stood at 126 confirmed kills in just 42 days of combat. They had lost 8 pilots. The mathematics were unprecedented, and they had the highest kill ratio of any squadron, British or Allied, in the entire battle. The men who had been called reckless and undisciplined had saved the country that didn't want them. The British pilots who survived learned from them. The 400-yard firing doctrine was quietly abandoned. The pretty Vic formations were replaced with the finger 4 combat spread that the Poles had insisted upon. The RAF adopted the tactics of the men they had forced to ride tricycles. But the ultimate vindication came with a cruel asterisk. When the war ended in 1945, Britain held a massive victory parade through London. Polish forces had fought alongside the British for 6 years. They had bled in the skies over England, in the deserts of North Africa, at Monte Cassino, at Arnhem. They expected to march. The invitation never came. Stalin demanded that Polish forces be excluded. The new communist government in Warsaw was not the same Poland these men had fought for. Churchill, exhausted and politically weakened, gave in. The pilots of 303 Squadron watched the parade from the sidewalks. The country they had saved celebrated without them. Most could never return home. Poland was behind the Iron Curtain now. They became taxi drivers in London, factory workers in Manchester, refugees in the country they had defended. Their story was quietly erased from British textbooks for decades. Today, a statue stands at the RAF Northolt Memorial. It shows a Polish pilot in flight gear looking toward the sky. The inscription reads, "We were the first." The story of 303 Squadron proves that desperation can be a weapon, that hatred can fuel an engine, and that sometimes the most dangerous pilot is the one who has already lost everything. If this story of innovation, skepticism, and technology proving the doubters wrong resonated with you, hit that subscribe button now. This channel uncover the forgotten technology of World War II, the inventions that seemed impossible until they changed everything. Drop a comment below. Would you have had the nerve to close to 100 yards before firing? And check the video on screen right now for another story of revolutionary weapons that changed the war.